With that, I would yield to Senator Peters for a question without losing my right to the floor.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague from Connecticut for yielding the floor for a question. And while I intend to ask my colleague from Connecticut shortly about the interaction between closing the terror gap for gun purchasers and expanding background checks, I would first like to take a moment to mourn the loss of the 49 people who were killed and recognize the dozens more who were wounded in the worst mass shooting that our nation has ever seen. And while my heart goes out to all of the family and friends of the victims, today I'd like to honor two Michigan men who lost their lives that night. Trevin Crosby and Christopher Andrew Leinan, who went by the name of Drew. Trevin was only 25. He was born in North Carolina, and he came to call Michigan home after finishing school and starting his own marketing business in Saginaw. Total Entrepreneurs Concept was the name of it. It was founded just last year, and his business already employed about 20 people and handles retail marketing for Fortune 500 companies. Tevin had recently visited family in North Carolina to watch several nieces and nephews graduate before traveling to Florida to see friends and colleagues. Drew was 32 and grew up in Metro Detroit before moving to Orlando with his mother. He became a civically minded activist early in life, starting a gay-straight alliance in high school before studying psychology and becoming a licensed mental health counselor. He recently won the Anne Frank Humanitarian Award for his work in the gay community. Drew was at Pulse with his partner, Juan Guerrero, who also lost his life that night. Now, instead of potentially helping them plan a wedding one day, their loving families are planning a joint funeral. They want their sons to be side by side as their friends and family pay their respects and bid them farewell. Orlando's events serve as a stark reminder that the fight for equality in this nation for LGBT Americans must not end with marriage equality. We still live in a nation where Americans can face discrimination and even be killed, simply because of who they love. We cannot tolerate violence that targets any individual based on their gender, sexuality, race, or religion. This horrific incident raises a number of questions. Was it a hate crime, an act of terrorism, an outgrowth of ease in which individuals in this country can purchase deadly weapons with high-capacity magazines, the heinous actions of a self-radicalized young man inspired by and swearing allegiance to ISIS? The answer to all these questions is yes. And I urge my colleagues and Americans across the country to resist painting this tragedy in simple, reductive terms. This attack was a hate crime. This attack was an act of terrorism. And yes, this attack speaks to the disturbing ease which dangerous firearms can be acquired in our nation. The problems that led to this tragedy are complex. But complexity is not an argument for inaction. We need to start somewhere. Thoughts and prayers can be meaningful and are certainly powerful, but we need to do more than just offer our thoughts and prayers. Now is the time for action. As senators, we have no higher duty than keeping the American people safe. This includes taking the fight to ISIS overseas with our allies and vigilant law enforcement here at home. My colleague from Connecticut has been discussing two simple, critical changes we can make to help prevent deaths from gun violence in our nation, including acts of terror like we have seen in Orlando. We need to keep guns away from those who shouldn't have them. This includes individuals convicted of domestic violence offenses, people with court order restraints related to stalking, and convicted felons. These groups are already barred under federal law from purchasing or otherwise possessing firearms, and this is enforced through background checks. It is also painfully clear that we need to keep guns out of the hands of terrorists. This is why we need to close the terror gap and prevent individuals on terrorist watch lists from purchasing firearms. Unfortunately, however, closing the terror gap and enforcing existing gun safety laws cannot be effective without universal background checks. It doesn't matter if we ban selling guns to people on the terror watch list if large percentages of purchasers avoid background check by buying a weapon at a gun show or over the internet. A story from our neighboring state, Wisconsin, haunts me as an example of violence that could have been stopped. Recently, a Wisconsin man subject to a restraining order from his estranged wife, a man who was barred under current law from purchasing a gun, was able to take advantage of the private seller loophole and purchase a weapon without a background check. He then confronted his wife at the spa where she worked. He killed her and 2 others, injured 4 more people before turning the gun on himself. Just like our current law bans of gun sales to those convicted of domestic violence or with restraining orders in place against them, closing the terror gap will only be fully effective if we have universal background checks. So my question to the senator from Connecticut is this. Senator, will closing the terror gap alone prevent the sale of weapons to potential terrorists here in the United States? Or will we need universal background checks to ensure that these individuals are not able to exploit the loopholes in the current law?
Thank you to the senator from Michigan for asking that question. It's really the crux of the debate here. It's our responsibility to do everything within our power to protect Americans from terrorist attack. The reality is that terrorist attack can come in many different forms, but recently it's been coming through one form, and that is firearms, and often very lethal military-style firearms. And so it is our duty to do everything possible to protect Americans from that new trend line in terrorist attack. And so you are very right. The answer to your question is that simply putting suspected terrorists on the list of those who are prohibited from buying weapons is not enough. Why? Because 40% of gun sales today are not happening in places where background checks are conducted. You have to do both. And it's not a secret. It's not a secret that you can go online to Arms List and easily get a weapon within minutes without having to go through a background check. It is full of holes like Swiss cheese. So there's not no utility, but there's limited utility in passing a inclusion of people on the terrorist watch list onto the list of those prohibited from buying weapons unless you do the secondary bill that we are asking for. And as Senator Durbin and I have talked about a number of times this afternoon, it also has the double benefit, expanding background checks, of addressing this secondary epidemic, mass shootings, but then also this question of how you stop urban gun violence, which is often perpetrated by individuals who have illegal weapons. Law enforcement, police chiefs, guys on the front lines in our cities will tell you, if you force every gun sale through a background check, or virtually every commercial gun sale through a background check, we will have less illegal firearms on our streets, and there will be less carnage on the streets of Chicago and New Orleans and Baltimore. So the answer to your question is yes. You have to do both in order to protect Americans from terrorist attack, but you also have to do both in order to address this ongoing slaughter that often doesn't rise to the level of getting on the national news every night, but it is a reality for people living in our cities. And I yield the floor if the gentleman has any other questions.
I don't. I think that
yield for a
sums
question.
it up, and I hope that this body will come together and take up this important legislation, this amendment. And if these are separated as 2 potential votes, which we are hearing may happen, I hope we understand that you can't vote for one and not the other and think that we are really dealing with this issue. If you only block someone who is on a terrorist list and do not require universal background checks, it's basically, it's a vote that may sound good, but is simply not going to be effective in dealing with this horrible situation and dealing with the incident that I mentioned from Wisconsin. But as you mentioned, these stories happen every day. They may not capture the national media with a horrible, tragic event like we saw in Orlando. But the devastation to the families who have been impacted is every bit as real every single day. And it is the obligation of this body to step up. So I appreciate that answer. I appreciate my colleague from Connecticut for standing up on this issue, and I look forward to working closely with you to address this.